There is a very specific kind of silence that changes shape after an avoidant leaves. At first, it feels brutal, empty, sharp, like being locked outside a door that was warm just hours ago. You replay everything, the way they slowly cooled, the way their eyes still softened when they looked at you, even while their words became harder to hold. The way they pulled away without fully explaining why. And in that silence, you start doing what wounded people always do when love becomes confusing. You search for meaning in the absence. You dissect the delay, you measure the distance, you ask yourself whether they ever cared at all. And then, just when you finally begin to steady your breathing without them, just when your hands stop reaching for your phone every few minutes, just when the ache becomes survivable, something happens. They reappear, not always dramatically. Sometimes it is a like, a name in your notifications, a message so casual it almost insults the depth of what happened. Sometimes it is a question that seems small on the surface and loaded underneath. Sometimes it is a sudden warmth after months of cold. A "Hey, how have you been?" that lands like a tremor in a body that fought hard to become calm again. And the shock is not just that they came back. It is that they became curious about you. Curious about your life. Curious about whether you still think of them. Curious about whether they still matter. And that curiosity can feel almost intoxicating when you once begged for clarity and got distance instead. But before you romanticize it, before you turn their curiosity into a love story, you need to understand something that may save your heart. Avoidants often become curious about you again, not when they are finally ready to love deeply, but when your emotional availability is no longer feeding their sense of safety. That is the brutal truth. The version of you who was always there, always understanding, always willing to reopen the connection after every retreat, created a strange kind of comfort for them. Not secure love, not intimacy in the mature sense, but access, emotional access without full emotional responsibility. They could come close, panic, back away, and somewhere inside, still trust that you would remain emotionally nearby, still attuned, still reachable, still orbiting the bond, even if they were the ones disrupting it. And when that changes, when your energy stops extending toward them, something starts happening inside their system that they do not know how to name. They become curious. Not because they forgot you and suddenly remembered your charm, not because some magical law of detachment made them obsessed, not because your silence tricked them into caring. No. They become curious because uncertainty has finally moved from your body into theirs. That shift is enormous. When you were the one waiting, wondering, checking, aching, they were protected from the full weight of your absence. They could manage closeness by pulling back, and the pattern still held. But when you stop chasing, when you stop over-explaining, when you stop translating their withdrawal into patience, their nervous system loses something it had quietly depended on: predictability. Not the predictability of healthy intimacy. That kind often overwhelms them. I mean the predictability of your continued emotional presence, your hope, your understanding. Your availability after neglect, your softness after confusion, your tendency to remain connected even when they became distant. The moment that disappears, they feel the gap. And the avoidant nervous system is fascinating in the saddest way. It longs for connection, but it often experiences connection as pressure. It wants closeness, but once closeness becomes real, the amygdala can light up like a warning system. Intimacy starts feeling less like home and more like exposure. The body registers dependence as danger. Cortisol rises. The system seeks relief. So they create distance, not always because love died, but because their body confused attachment with threat. That is why their behavior can seem so contradictory. They can think about you constantly and still not reply. They can miss you and still resist you. They can feel drawn toward you and then suddenly need space. They can care, deeply even, and still behave in ways that make care feel invisible. This is the part people get wrong. They assume that if an avoidant pulls away, the feelings must be gone. Often, the opposite is true. Sometimes they pulled away because the feelings were becoming too real. Because the bond was no longer fantasy. It was becoming attachment. It was becoming need. It was becoming the possibility of being seen, affected, changed. And for someone whose nervous system was shaped around emotional self-protection, that can feel terrifying. So they do what has always helped them survive overwhelming closeness. They detach. They minimize, they distract, they go numb. They tell themselves they need freedom when what they actually need is regulation. But here is what they do not expect. Distance does not erase attachment. It only delays the moment they have to feel it. At first, they may experience relief, less emotional intensity, less pressure, more room to breathe, more control. This is the phase people mistake for indifference. They think the avoidant is thriving because the avoidant looks composed, functional, unbothered. But avoidants are often most convincing right before the deeper wave arrives. Because once the initial relief settles, something quieter begins. The nervous system calms just enough for buried attachment to leak through the cracks. And now you are no longer right there, offering reassurance, energy, pursuit, emotional immediacy. Now your presence is uncertain. Now the bond is no longer being maintained for them by your effort. That is when curiosity begins to bloom. They start wondering what you are doing. They start wondering if you are moving on. They start wondering if someone else is receiving the tenderness they once pulled away from. They start checking small things they told themselves did not matter. They notice your absence in moments where your presence used to regulate them more than they ever admitted. And because avoidants are so often disconnected from their emotional language, curiosity becomes the socially acceptable doorway into feelings they cannot easily tolerate. They do not come back saying, "I feel the loss of you in my chest at night." They do not usually say, "My body finally misses what my mind pushed away." They do not say, "The version of me that ran is now haunted by what your absence is teaching me." They say something lighter. Safer, more indirect. "How have you been? Just thought of you. Random question. Hope you're doing well." Curiosity is often the disguise longing wears when vulnerability still feels dangerous. And if you have ever been on the receiving end of that shift, you know how destabilizing it can be. Because part of you wants to believe this means they changed, that they finally understand, that they finally feel what you felt, that the silence matured them, that your absence revealed your value. Sometimes it did, but value recognized too late is still late. That matters. Because curiosity is not commitment, interest is not intimacy, reaching out is not repair. You have to understand the psychology underneath the moment, or you will confuse movement with transformation. Avoidants often become curious about you again when the emotional structure changes in a way they can no longer control, when your energy is not available on demand, when your attention is no longer assumed, when you stop performing the emotional labor that kept the bond alive even while they were withdrawing. Suddenly, they are no longer managing closeness. They are confronting loss, and loss awakens what closeness often buries in them. Imagine them alone at night, not in a dramatic movie scene way. In the ordinary loneliness that hits when distraction wears off. The phone screen dims. The room is quiet. No conversation to avoid, no intimacy to manage, no emotional expectation in the air. Just space, and in that space, the memory of you becomes louder than when you were actually there. That is the irony. Your love felt heavy when it was present because it asked them to feel in real time. But once you are gone, your absence becomes easier to romanticize than your presence ever was to hold. Now they can remember your warmth without having to respond to it. They can miss your steadiness without being asked to match it. They can idealize the connection because it no longer demands anything from them in the moment. And this is where curiosity deepens into obsession for some avoidants. Not healthy obsession. Not devotion, more like intrusive returning, emotional recycling. They revisit your words, your photos, old messages, little moments they acted casual about at the time. They remember the look on your face when you were trying to understand them. They think about things they should have said. They wonder if you still see them the way you once did. They want to know if the door is still unlocked, even if they are not sure they know how to walk through it properly. This is important to hear. A lot of avoidants do not just miss you. They miss the version of themselves they got to be in your presence. The softened version, the wanted version, the version that could touch warmth without fully surrendering to it. Your love may have offered them something rare, a felt sense of emotional home that they did not know how to sustain. So when they become curious again, it is not always only about you as a person. It is also about access to that emotional mirror, access to the feeling of still mattering, still being remembered, still having a place in your inner world. And if you do not understand this, you will hand your healing back too quickly. because curiosity from an avoidant can feel incredibly intimate. They ask about your life in ways they never did before. They notice details, they seem softer, more open, more present. There is often a sweetness to it, almost childlike, as if they are reaching from a place that has finally run out of defenses. Sometimes they are, but softness after distance is not the same as safety. Please hear that. The danger is not in their curiosity itself. Curiosity is human. Curiosity may even be sincere. The danger is in what you imagine it means. Because when someone once made you feel invisible, their renewed attention can feel like emotional oxygen. You breathe it too fast. You call it closure, fate, second chance, confirmation. You forget that a nervous system in withdrawal from your absence may sound very similar to a heart that is ready to love you well. Those are not the same thing. One wants relief. The other offers stability. One reaches because the silence became uncomfortable. The other stays when intimacy becomes uncomfortable. That difference will determine whether you heal or repeat, and repetition is seductive, especially when the avoidant finally seems emotionally awake. Suddenly they are the one initiating. The one wondering, the one lingering, the one checking your stories, watching your changes, asking questions that make it seem like they cannot stop thinking about you. But what they are often reacting to is not only love, it is the collapse of certainty. You are no longer emotionally predictable. You are no longer easily available. You are no longer soothing the discomfort they created. And humans, especially emotionally avoidant humans, become deeply curious about what they can no longer access so easily. It is the same nervous system that once recoiled from too much closeness, now reacting to the possibility of disconnection. First, closeness feels dangerous. Then distance feels dangerous. That is the internal split. That is why avoidance can look so confusing from the outside. Their body vacillates between fear of engulfment and fear of loss. They pull away to regulate one fear, then circle back to regulate the other. This is why your silence matters so much. Not manipulative silence, not performative detachment. Not pretending not to care so they will chase. That still keeps you psychologically trapped in their response. I mean real silence. Silence as self-return. Silence as nervous system protection. Silence as the decision to stop interrupting the consequence of their choices. That kind of silence changes the whole emotional geometry. Because now they cannot locate themselves through your pursuit. They cannot measure their significance by how quickly you reopen the door. They cannot keep you in the role of steady emotional witness while they remain inconsistent. Now they have to sit inside the uncertainty they used to assign to you. And uncertainty creates curiosity faster than certainty ever could. It makes them look. It makes them wonder. It makes them remember. It makes them imagine what you are becoming without them. And that last part can hit the avoidant harder than they expect. Your growth, your stability, your quiet, your refusal to chase, your ability to become whole without their validation. That is often when curiosity turns sharp, because now it is not just about whether you still care. It is about whether they have lost their place in the version of you they once assumed would remain emotionally open to them. They begin to sense that you are no longer revolving around the wound. No longer organizing your life around their confusion. No longer available to be reactivated so easily. That can make them miss you in a way they never allowed themselves to while you were right there. Because now your value is no longer cushioned by access. Now it is at risk of being gone. And people often feel most clearly what they failed to honor only when proximity is no longer guaranteed. Still, this is the part where you must become very honest with yourself. If they are suddenly curious about you again, what are they actually offering? Are they opening the door to true accountability? Are they naming the pattern? Are they showing the capacity to stay in difficult emotional conversations without retreating? Are they bringing consistency where there used to be confusion? Are they demonstrating nervous system maturity, not just emotional hunger? Or are they simply curious because your absence finally became louder than your presence once was? That question is everything, because curiosity alone can restart the bond without repairing the structure. And then you are right back inside the cycle. Warmth, hope, closeness, activation, withdrawal, confusion, longing, return. The same song with a different tempo. So yes, avoidants often do become curious about you again. Deeply curious. Sometimes maddeningly so, but not always for the reasons wounded hope wants to believe. They become curious because you stopped being emotionally available in the old way, because the pattern lost its fuel, because your absence made them feel what your presence once overwhelmed them into avoiding, because uncertainty entered their body, because loss activated what closeness had frightened. Because the human heart has a tragic habit of reaching for what it only knows how to value once it is no longer safe to assume. But none of that means you should abandon yourself to be rediscovered. That is the warning. Do not let their curiosity become your collapse. Do not hand your healing over to someone whose emotional timing only awakens when your energy is gone. Do not confuse being missed with being met. They may be curious. They may be sincere in fragments. They may even be aching more than you know. But if they have not learned how to remain present when intimacy stirs their defenses, then their curiosity is still happening inside the same unhealed architecture that made them leave. And unhealed architecture cannot build a safe home, no matter how beautiful the apology sounds in the doorway. So what do you do with their curiosity? You do not rush to reward it. You do not punish it either. You observe it, calmly, cleanly, without collapsing into old meanings. You let them show you whether curiosity becomes consistency, whether interest becomes effort, whether reaching becomes repair, whether their nervous system can tolerate the very closeness their absence made them crave again. That is where power shifts for real, not in making them miss you. Not in being the mystery they cannot solve, not in learning tricks to trigger pursuit. Real power is when their curiosity no longer controls your worth. When their message does not resurrect the version of you who once begged to be understood. When their attention no longer feels like proof that you matter. When you can feel the pull of the old chemistry and still choose what protects your peace. That is transformation, because the deepest lesson here is not about them. It is about what their return reveals in you. The part of you that still wants their curiosity to mean redemption. The part that hopes being chosen later will erase the pain of not being held properly before. The part that confuses delayed recognition with destiny. That part needs your compassion. But it also needs your honesty. Someone becoming curious about you again is not the ending of the story. It is the test. The test of whether you still abandon yourself when attention returns. The test of whether your self-worth still rises and falls with their emotional availability. The test of whether you have learned that love is not measured by who comes back curious, but by who stays clear. And once you pass that test, everything changes. You stop seeing their return as power over you. You see it as information, information that they feel the shift, information that your absence landed. Information that what they avoided did not disappear, it echoed. Information that your value became visible the moment access was no longer guaranteed. But your value was never created by their curiosity. It was only revealed to them by your distance. Do not forget that. Because the final shift is this. You stop asking why avoidants suddenly become curious about you again, as if the answer determines your worth. You begin to understand that their curiosity says more about their nervous system than about your lovability. It says that loss can reach places closeness could not. It says that uncertainty unsettles people who once relied on your emotional certainty. It says that what they avoided feeling in your presence now has room to rise in your absence. But your job is no longer to translate that into hope. Your job is to translate it into freedom. Freedom from needing their confusion to become clarity before you move on. Freedom from measuring love by delayed reactions. Freedom from romanticizing people who only feel deeply once they can no longer feel safely in control. And in that freedom, a new identity begins. You become the person who is no longer hypnotized by being rediscovered. The person who does not mistake curiosity for capacity. The person who understands that being deeply wanted in moments of loss is not the same as being deeply protected in moments of intimacy. The person who no longer needs someone's late awakening to confirm what should have been obvious from the start. You were always worth consistency. You were always worth presence. You are always worth a love that does not require disappearance to generate devotion. So let them be curious. Let them wonder what happened to the version of you who once waited. Let them feel the mystery of your peace. Let them sit with the ache of what your absence teaches. Let them learn if they are willing that people are not permanently available to be emotionally postponed. And you keep becoming not cold, not cruel, not closed, just clear. Clear that your heart is not a waiting room for someone else's emotional readiness. Clear that your silence is no longer a protest, it is a boundary. Clear that the right person will not need to lose access to your warmth before they realize its value. Clear that being chosen late is not always a victory. Sometimes it is just evidence that you finally stopped chasing what should have known how to stay. That is why avoidants suddenly become curious about you again. Because your absence speaks in a language their defenses cannot easily mute. But the deeper question is no longer why they are curious. It is why you ever believed their confusion had the authority to define your worth. Once you stop believing that, their curiosity becomes smaller, and you become larger, steadier. Softer with yourself, less available to emotional riddles, more devoted to peace than to potential. And that is the kind of power they can feel even from a distance, not the power of revenge. The power of no longer needing to be rediscovered in order to know you were always rare.